One of the things that I think matters most to people is the freedoms that we enjoy in the United States of America. The country is on lockdown, except we're not locked down at the national level. We're locked down on the state level. And I thought we'd talk about that with John Malcolm, who's vice president of the Institute for Constitutional Government at the Heritage Foundation. John, it's good to have you back on the program. I hope you and yours are safe.
Thank you, Lars. Yes, we're doing fine, and it's always good to be with you.
Very good. It's nice to have you on the program. Here's the concern people have. We've seen people, state government officials for the most part, in some cases city officials, say we have to do things to make sure this disease does not spread so rapidly that it overwhelms our medical system. It seems we've been largely successful. I haven't heard of a single instance where a hospital or the medical system has been overwhelmed, and all of the crying need a few weeks ago for ventilators and masks and all that. We seem to have met all the demand, and it sounds like the country's well on the path toward making sure we don't ever run short of those things again. But in some cases, are the states going far beyond where they have to go and actually stepping on people's constitutional liberties?
Well, they might very well. And actually, as the curve has been flattened and we pass peak in a number of areas, the calculus may change. So basically setting the structure is that under the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, there's a lot of residual police power that is left to the states. And the federal government doesn't control that. We have a system of federalism. And governors and other state and local officials are tasked with protecting the health, safety, and welfare of the inhabitants of those states. And certainly during times of crises, those powers expand, and certainly trying to stem the spread of a pandemic constitutes, a clear threat to the safety and welfare of the citizens of different states. And they've been imposing all of these different edicts. Now, that having been said, that they have a legitimate reason for doing some of this stuff, there has to be a rational fit between the action that's taken and the goal to be achieved, stopping the pandemic. They can't apply these rules in an arbitrary or discriminatory manner. And with respect to, the impingement of civil liberties, and we certainly have all had our civil liberties impinged upon, on a number of them, such as your freedom of speech, your freedom of worship, not only does the government or the state in this case have to establish that they have a compelling interest, which they do, but that the means they are using to achieve that interest are the least restrictive means possible. So let's pick an example. They have stopped churches from having large in-church gatherings. But then the mayor of Louisville, for instance, and elsewhere, they stopped trying to stop these drive-by services the churches were doing, in which the churches said, look, everyone's going to remain in their cars. They're going to be at least 6 feet apart. They're going to keep their windows only halfway down. The only people outside of the cars are going to be the pastor and a videographer. And the court said, no, look, you have the right to free exercise of your religion. There is a compelling government interest involved, but you can achieve that compelling government interest in a less restrictive manner than banning these services. So long as people are following all of the applicable safe distance regulations that are in place, they should be able to exercise their constitutional right to, gather and worship together in congregation.
I mean, in some ways, John, it makes me doubt the common sense of some of the people in public office when they say we're going to ban a church from having 400 or 500 people in a single room, for Sunday service. But we're also going to ban the drive-up church services. And you wonder, who is it that's making this judgment call without saying, hold on, everybody's in their cars. Families are in their cars who are already living together. If they've all got the China virus, they're all inside their car. They're not going to give it to anybody else. I mean, I understand the goal of saying don't put 400 people or 4,000 people in a megachurch. On the other hand, Don't put 4 people in a car to do drive-in church service. Just seems foolish. And it seems like these people have let the power go to their heads.
Well, there's definitely something to that, too. So as I say, as we pass the peak and we flatten the curve, I think that people are going to look at some of these government restrictions with a more jaundiced eye. Both the courts will, to the extent to which they're challenged in court, and also the public will. You're starting this past week to see protests of a number of these edicts. And I go by somewhat the philosophy with respect to government officials. just because you can doesn't mean that you should. And you're seeing this, for instance, with police who are finding people who are walking alone in parks where they're not supposed to be. And instead of issuing them a warning and, telling them to move along, they're issuing them citations. And in some cases, they're arresting them and fining them and incarcerating them. People's nerves are frayed for good and understandable reasons, and a little bit of common sense and a defter touch, I think, would remind people that it's good to obey the law and to maintain safety procedures, and they will not engender the kind of resentment that overbearing officials, law enforcement officials and public officials, all the criticism that they get when they act in an overbearing fashion. And some of these officials are going to end up paying a price at the ballot box.
It's funny, John, because I know that the average cop doesn't probably have the latitude. If his boss says the park is closed, anybody you find there is in violation, that he has to answer to his boss, the chief, who's telling him to go out and enforce that rule, and then common sense that might say, this is a single man or woman, or a man and a child, woman and a child, walking through the park. They're not putting anybody in danger. I should use my discretion, just as cops use their discretion on a regular basis. Give you a warning instead of a ticket for being a little bit over the speed limit. And yet, like you said, nerves are frayed, and probably the nerves of both police chiefs and mayors and everything else. How do we get back to that sort of common sense? Because I hate to see it all go to court, because courts then lay down further layers of rules, which everybody below them has to abide by.
Yeah, look, I think that public officials, including law enforcement officers, need to pay attention to the feedback that they are getting in terms of the protests that they are encountering, and zero-tolerance policies, while on occasion are good policies to adopt. It's rare, and this is certainly not one of those times.
Well, and it's funny because I happen to make my home in the state of Washington, on the left coast. I know you're back in D.C., but the governor of the state of Washington, I don't go fishing, I go more hunting, but he's banned fishing. And he's literally, some of these are just so crazy you can't even believe it. You can go out and sit in your boat and all day long if you want to. But if you sit in your boat and pick up a fishing pole, you're in violation of the law. And nobody, for the life of them, can even understand. This guy ran for president for about 10 seconds, but he's put down an edict saying you can sit in your boat, but you can't pick up a fishing rod. And you wonder, what does that have to do with getting insane. China virus?
Yeah, that just seems insane to me. And, people ought to protest and ought to say, look, I don't have a constitutional right to fish. But on the other hand, if you keep constraining people's ability to go and enjoy, any part of life when they actually are able to get outside their homes, that's going to lead to all kinds of not only resentment from people, but actually people who suffer from things like depression. It can end up having a real health problem. If you end up isolating people who suffer from severe depression long enough, they're going to do terrible things like commit suicide. I'm not suggesting that everybody who isn't allowed to fish is going to commit suicide, but to some extent, people during these incredibly tense times need to have some kind of an emotional outlet.
I couldn't agree with you more. John, you and your family and your friends stay safe, and we always appreciate your views from the Heritage Foundation. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lars. Good to be with you.